Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to Experiential Spirituality, episode 13, The Alien Agenda. As ever, you can ask me any question you want through Curious Cat, the link to which is in the description box below. You can contact me on Twitter and you can buy my book through the links below. Thank you to everyone who has said nice things about the book so far, including Greta in the chat who says, "Hi David, won't be able to join the live chat today, but we'll catch up later. I can't say enough good things about the book. It's helping me every day. Thank you so much." Well, thank you for saying that. And thank you also to those who have left reviews on Amazon. I know there are some of you have contacted me on Twitter, but none of those reviews have appeared on Amazon yet. I have no idea what's going on. I know that one of the reviews was left a fortnight ago, so it really should have shown up on Amazon by now. There was nothing in the review, as far as I know, that broke any of Amazon's rules. I know that you have to spend a certain amount of money on Amazon before you can leave a review, but from what I understand, from what people have told me, there are certain reviews that really should have showed up on the Amazon page already, and I have no idea why they haven't. It's hugely inconvenient for me because, of course, I'm really up against it. Releasing a book as I did, I'm really spitting into an ocean, and so I really need everything that helps in order to help the book propagate, essentially, or to raise awareness concerning the book. And so not having Amazon reviews appear is not helpful at all, but there's not much I can do about it because Amazon is Amazon. It's a massive faceless corporation, and it's not like you can just pick up the phone and call them. It is what it is. There's no point going on about it, but that's just the reality. So if you've left a review on Amazon, I very much appreciate it because I need as many reviews as I can get, but for some reason Amazon just isn't showing them. Last week I mentioned that 12 is my favourite number. There's a lot of significance in the number 12 for all kinds of reasons, and this 13th episode is going to begin ushering in a change in these experiential spirituality live streams, namely the fact that they're going to get more topical. It's really a necessary thing to do on YouTube in the modern day, because what I've done so far in the first 12 episodes is really just cover much the same ground each week, and I did that on purpose. The first 7 episodes were designed just for me to lay the groundwork so that anyone who begins watching these live streams can know what I'm all about, essentially. The episodes from episode 8 to episode 12, they were just really responding to questions and reorientating myself now that the book is released. But now I'm going to get more topical. You see, if I don't get more topical, then this channel will simply stagnate, which it has already, as I knew would happen. But what will soon happen is that because I'm pretty much saying the same things every week, those who still watch these live streams will eventually just fall away. And it's necessary to address topical issues because people are typically interested in recent events, essentially. The thing is that every YouTuber, certainly a YouTuber like myself who's been on this website across various channels since 2005, every YouTuber knows what they have to do to get more views. It's really just a question of what they're prepared to do, and that's always been the issue for me. For example, I'm sure that no one who watches these live streams would like to see 2-minute daily videos that involve lots of jump cuts, that involve lots of graphics on screen, that involve lots of noise. That's what YouTube's algorithm favors, and it's what most people enjoy because most souls have a short attention span. They want something they can watch quickly and then just be done with it. But I'm not prepared to go that far, obviously. My streams are always going to be long form, if you like, and so there's certain lines I can't cross, but I can certainly address topical issues because I can always look at them in light of spirituality, which is what I want to do. And that's certainly what I want to do with this week's subject, which is the whole media storm of the last week concerning UFOs and aliens. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this episode. But before I do that, there are some questions that I want to respond to. This first question comes from Curious Cat, and in fact they all do, but this is the only one that's still on Curious Cat because I didn't think I was going to do a live stream this week, and so I responded to some questions on Twitter already. But this question, only left an hour ago, this individual says, I started reading your book as an agnostic, and I finished it still being an agnostic. I accept that consciousness cannot be explained by physical processes, something that I think is meant to say something that turned me away from atheism. But how do we go from that to saying that consciousness is God? I have started meditating, but even if I have a spiritual experience from it, how will I know that thing is God? Is it just a matter of epiphany? Well, this is the kind of question, and the way it's structured and the way that question comes at the end of additional information, this is the kind of question that would best be responded to in a dialogue, I feel. But the short answer to the end question is yes. Recognizing that spirit is consciousness is only the beginning. I point that out in chapter 2, and the rest of the book essentially concerns going deeper into that consciousness, into that spirit, and that's when you discover that spirit consciousness is indeed God. But additionally, I'll say two things. First of all, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, the book is not written to convince anyone of spiritual realities. There are souls in this world who are dedicated to turning people from atheists or agnostics to those who accept the reality of the spiritual. That's not my focus at all. In fact, in chapter 6 of the book, I explicitly say that philosophical materialism is not a subject that I feel is worth addressing at all. I've got 2 more books planned, and neither of them will deal with philosophical materialism. My focus, I feel, the way it's played out so far, is clearing up confusion surrounding spiritual matters. So the book is written for those who already accept the reality of the spiritual, but those who are confused about it, and those who want to have a fruitful spirituality. Now, having said that, in chapter 2 of the book, I point out that what the ancients called spirit is indeed consciousness. But the thing is that I don't just flat out say that. I elaborate on why. I illustrate how that is the case. I give examples from the biblical scriptures. I give examples from the Gnostic scriptures. In chapter 3 there's a section called Essence, and what I do in that section is I look at commonly asserted truths concerning the spirit, and I point out how they are obviously true of consciousness. And so throughout chapters 2 and 3 I'm demonstrating that what the ancients called spirit is nothing other than consciousness, quite simply. So my first question to the one that left that question on Curious Cat would be, do you accept that? Do you accept that when the ancients referred to spirit they were referring to consciousness? Because if you accept that much, then you already do believe in God. What you don't believe in is God as he is typically portrayed by religionists. If you accept that the biblical texts and the ancients, when they refer to spirit, they were referring to consciousness, then you do believe in God, because there is no alternate understanding at that point. And so that's what I mean when I say that the best way to respond to that question would be a dialogue, because I'd have to ask that question back, because the individual who left that question didn't mention the way I demonstrated that what the ancients referred to as spirit is nothing but consciousness. So I don't know if the individual who left that question actually accepts that. And if they do accept that, then they do believe in God. It's just not God as he is typically portrayed by religionists. But again, the short answer to the question would be yes. Recognizing that spirit is nothing other than consciousness is only the beginning. Then one has to venture into that consciousness, and that's what chapters 3 to 12 of my book ultimately deal with. And so, although my book isn't written for agnostics or atheists, they can certainly benefit from it, and I'm delighted to hear that you have begun to engage in the meditation, presumably the meditation that I recommended in chapter 3. So the next question I want to respond to, I have already responded to on Twitter, because again, I did not know if I would do a live stream this weekend, and the only reason I did do a live stream is because, again, I'm going to begin addressing topical issues, and I wanted to address this media furore over UFOs and aliens as soon as possible while it was still relevant, because it won't be for long, I can assure you of that. But this question that I have already answered on Twitter is a very good question, and so I want to answer it again here on the live stream. And the question was, what is the relationship between Logos and Spirit? So as many of you will know, Logos is just the Greek term for word. It's word that is written in English translations of the New Testament, most of them anyway. So in the Gospel of John, for example, Yeshua, Jesus, is the Word of God. So the question is, what is the difference between the Spirit of God and the Word of God? And that is a fantastic question, because the difference is quite subtle. I do convey it in my book, but I don't think I've ever got a sentence where I say, this is the difference. But quite simply, as I said on Twitter, the difference between the Spirit of God and the Word of God is the difference between you and the expression of you. So Yeshua is the Word of God because he explained God to the Jewish people 2,000 years ago. He illustrated the nature of God to the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, because as the Apostle John said in the Gospel of John chapter 1 verse 18, nobody has ever seen God. The only Son who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. And so that's why Yeshua is the Word of God. He's the expression of God. So the difference between Spirit and Word is that Word is the expression of Spirit. As I say in the book, the divine, which is, Yeshua is divine, the divine translates deity to the rest of creation, because deity, God, is incomprehensible. We can't conceive of God. Anytime we are conceiving of God, our conception is necessarily wrong. And what the divine does, Yeshua as the Word of God, for example, is they express deity in a way that our minds can grasp, and in a way that allows us to come closer to the incomprehensible fullness, as the Apostle Paul put it, of God. So it's a great question. What is the difference between the Spirit of God and the Word of God? It's that the Word of God is an expression of the nature of Spirit, essentially. Again, it's really the difference between you and the expression of you, an understanding of you. And I think it's especially important to address that question live, because there are so many souls around YouTube that use the word Logos, and they use it in an entirely wrong way. They use it in a way that is appropriate for whatever message they're trying to push. But the first thing to understand is that Logos comes from Greek philosophy, which a lot of them will acknowledge, but what they don't acknowledge quite often is that different Greek philosophers had different understandings of what Logos meant. In the context of something like the Gospel of John, you're looking at the Platonic understanding of Logos, which was essentially divine reason. It's funny, there's a lot of philosophical materialists in the modern day, and they always refer to figures like Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras and so forth as if they were hardcore rationalists, hardcore materialists like themselves, but that was far from the case. The only one who could say that Plato was some kind of philosophical materialist is someone who's never read Plato. Plato's works are full of the supernatural. It was really innate to his worldview. The Logos is divine reason, that which bridges the gap between man and God, essentially. That's why Yeshua was called the Word of God, because Yeshua, of course, was held to be the mediator between man and God. He is that which explains God to the rest of his creation. Okay, I think I've belaboured that point enough, but it was a great question and I wanted to answer it. So, to turn to the subject of this week's live stream, I want to address this recent media blitz concerning UFOs and aliens. Well, the very fact that there is a media blitz on this subject really should tell you everything that you need to know, because, as has often been said, the truth will not be televised. You know something is false the moment that the media is pushing it in such a zealous way. Not only that, the way they're expressing it is also very telling. It reveals that they don't believe it themselves. They don't believe what they're saying. Because you'll notice that when you've got these news presenters explaining these things, or talking about how, well, the Pentagon has more or less confirmed the existence of aliens, they're doing it in a very patronising way. And media figures have a habit of doing this. It's something that's occurred in the last decade, and it's getting worse and worse, is that they talk to their audience like children. So it's almost like they're sharing a joke among themselves. Like they appear all giddy and excited on screen, speculating about UFOs, and then one presenter will look to another, kind of give a knowing look, and then giggle to themselves as if, the silly little people out there, they enjoy these stories about UFOs. So there's that very transparent attitude, but also the fact that they can't believe it because they're not acting like they believe it. Consider the hysteria, for example, of the past year with this virus. Consider how hysterical many souls have become over the threat of this relatively minor virus. They have been some of the worst at instilling fear in souls over this virus, and they themselves live in fear of this virus. They're talking about it constantly. They're constantly afraid of it, essentially. Now, if souls like that honestly believed that there were aliens, that the Pentagon or the government really had confirmed the existence of aliens, there is no way that they would be taking it so lightly. There is no way that they would be sitting there laughing and joking about it, and talking to you like your children as they relate these things. They would be petrified. It would be like a doomsday scene in some film. There would be those of a more cult-like mentality gathering together to welcome or to look out for these aliens. There would be people outright killing themselves over the prospect of having to face extraterrestrial life because of all the things they've seen portrayed in films. Basically, you can tell that those in the media don't believe a word of this, and that those in the government don't believe a word of this, because if they did believe what they were saying, then they wouldn't be taking it so lightly. They would be hysterical, and we would never hear the end of it. This is just another, a very common issue that the government uses to distract souls from real issues. And I want to go way back to where this began, which is in World War II. Now, the reason I happen to, whenever subjects like this come about, the reason I always have something to say about it, the reason I'm familiar with these subjects is quite simply because, as many of you will know, in my youth when I was 8 years old, I remember when it was exactly, when I was 8 years old, I became enamoured with the subject of the lost continent of Atlantis. I remember how it happened. You see, in 1992, when I was 8 years old, my family got our first PC, and with that PC came a game. It was Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, the point-and-click adventure. And I was already a fan of Indiana Jones. A friend had introduced me to Indiana Jones with Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It was the best thing I'd ever seen, as far as I was concerned as a kid. So when this PC arrived and it had an Indiana Jones game with it, I thought, well, this is amazing, this is mind-blowing. So I played the game and it was great. But I also read the manual for the game. And at the back of the manual, there was this little message that said that even though Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis is obviously a work of fiction, actually Atlantis is held to be a real place. And what this little message gave you was a biography, essentially, it gave you a list of all the most famous works that had been written on the subject of Atlantis. The usual suspects, obviously, Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. That's where that's our original source for the legend of Atlantis. Then you've got Ignatius Donnelly's The Antediluvian World. Ignatius Donnelly was a politician, and he fully believed in Atlantis, and his work, The Antediluvian World, it really changed everything in the late 19th century, and it ushered in a century of Atlantis obsession, the likes of which had never been before. I mean, for 2,000 years since Plato's account of the subject of Atlantis, there have been souls who have been interested in Atlantis, but after Ignatius Donnelly's book, it really entered a popular consciousness, because Ignatius Donnelly's book, which I have a copy of, I've got a copy of every book on Atlantis that has ever been written, and that's not a short number of books, and I've read them all. But Ignatius Donnelly's book, it was really a good example of the popular culture, or kind of a more sophisticated form of popular culture of its time, because yes, ostensibly it's dealing with complicated subject matter, it's dealing with archaeology, it's dealing with history, but not really. It's very, very easy to read. I mean, when Ignatius Donnelly, for example, points out, well, look, there are pyramids in Egypt, there are pyramids in Central America, surely that means there was some source in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, that settlers fled from and brought this influence to these disparate countries. That's not high-minded. Anyone who reads that book can understand that. And so it really propelled Atlantis into popular consciousness, and you also had more occult figures like Madame Helena Blavatsky, an occultist who I'll mention again very shortly. You had Edgar Cayce, the famous Christian mystic, the so-called sleeping prophet. All kinds of figures. Rudolf Steiner, he mentioned Atlantis quite a lot. So you've got this great interest in Atlantis, and just for the record, as I said, the original source for the story of Atlantis that we have are Plato's dialogue, the Timaeus and the Critias. But in those dialogues, it's not like Plato himself was just telling what he knew of Atlantis. He was relating, according to him, what his ancestor Solon had learned from Egyptian priests in Sais, because apparently in the city of Sais in Egypt, the story of Atlantis was inscribed upon a pillar, and so the Egyptian priest says to Solon, one of the 7 wise men, ancestor of Plato, that Solon, you Greeks are all like children. You think there has been one catastrophe, but really there have been many. And the Egyptian priest goes on to explain how the world goes in cycles. And so when Plato was relating the account of Atlantis in his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, according to him, this information was received from his ancestor Solon, who in turn got it from an Egyptian priest in Sais. So, I'm about to do a whole show on the subject of Atlantis here. The point is that I became aware of the legend of Atlantis when I was 8 years old, and I became enamored by it. I read every book I could possibly get my hands on. I know the subject inside out, and as I always used to say, I haven't said it in a while, but I'll say it again now. When you begin to study the subject of Atlantis, you end up studying absolutely everything, especially everything in the paranormal and the occult and things like that, and ultimately the spiritual. That's the reason that every time some subject comes up, some obscure subject or some paranormal, supernatural subject comes up, I happen to know something about it, because in studying Atlantis, you really do study everything else. When I was in high school, my nickname was the Prince of Atlantis, and it used to frustrate me, not because it's a bad nickname, because let's face it, there are far worse nicknames, but the reason that nickname came about is because, first of all, everyone in my high school knew that I had this obsession with the subject of Atlantis, but, and this is the bit that frustrated me at the time, there was a cartoon on at that time called The Prince of Atlantis, and that's where the nickname came from, because they knew I was interested in Atlantis, but all they knew about Atlantis was the cartoon, therefore I was the Prince of Atlantis. fine. But what bothered me about that at the time is that this cartoon, it was a really science fiction, a sci-fi depiction of Atlantis. It had the Atlanteans as mermen essentially, and they lived in these underwater domes, I think. The irony is I never actually watched the cartoon myself, but it was something like that. So what frustrated me at the time is that they knew I was interested in Atlantis, but because of the cartoon they seemed to have this idea that I believed in mermen living underwater, when in fact Plato's account of Atlantis was very grounded. I mean, obviously it involves the Greek gods, but the Atlantean culture itself was very down to earth. Plato described Atlantis as having chariots, for example. They had spearmen. He described how their capital city was structured, the way it worked. So there was nothing really fantastical about the Atlantean people as Plato described them. You know what's funny though? This gives you a good insight into how reliable certain documentaries are. But there was once a Channel 4 documentary on the subject of Atlantis, and in it at one point the narrator says that the citizens of Atlantis were said to have no horses, nor no need of them. Now that's not true, first of all. Plato explicitly says that not only did the Atlanteans have horses for their cavalry and for their chariots, but he also says that, well, you'll probably know that the city of Atlantis consisted of concentric circles. And the central island of those circles, Plato explicitly says that they had baths for their horses. They actually had baths for horses, according to Plato. So the Atlanteans definitely had horses. But the thing is, I know exactly where that Channel 4 documentary got this idea that the Atlanteans had no horses from. I know where they got it from. You know where they got it from? They got it from the game Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. Because in Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, the game from 1992, there's a lost dialogue of Plato, a fictional sequel to the Critias. It's called the Hermocrates, but it's a thing that was made up for the game. But in the game, you can actually read this third lost dialogue, or this lost dialogue of Plato, the sequel to the Critias, the Hermocrates. And in the Hermocrates, this fictional work within a 1992 video game, the author says that the Atlanteans had no horses but no need of them. So this Channel 4 documentary, its research was so thorough that they somehow managed to convey information from a video game about Atlantis, something that completely contradicted Plato's actual account. You know, I think that was the moment I realised that just because something, and I was very young when I saw this documentary, but I knew all about Atlantis by this point. I think that was the point in my life when I realised that just because something is on TV and it's a documentary and it's all official and it's got great production values and the person narrating has a doctorate and they sound very professional, that doesn't mean what they're saying is true, because I knew that was false and I knew where they were getting their information from. And so that was a certain awakening for me. Because I realised from that point forth you can't necessarily trust these so-called professionals, because they make mistakes and sometimes they make silly mistakes. But I've done it. I've gone off on a tangent about Atlantis when this is really about aliens, so let me get back to aliens. So because I was always interested in Atlantis, I ended up looking into all these other subjects. So to the subject of aliens, and specifically the way that the media have always employed aliens, the government have always employed aliens, since World War II, we have to go back to World War II itself, which is always a subject fraught with difficulty, because World War II and the events surrounding it, it's one of the more referenced events from history, and yet also one of the more misunderstood events. How should I say this? It's one of the more ignorantly referenced events. And I'm not just talking about the fact that there are many souls in the modern day who just throw around the term Nazi carelessly, which they do, and I'll address that in just a moment. But it goes a little bit deeper than that, really, because, for example, there are many who quite innocently will refer to German soldiers in World War II as Nazi soldiers. But this is really an illustration of how a lot of souls really don't know what Nazism was exactly. The Nazis were a political party. They were the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And so to call the German soldiers of World War II Nazi soldiers would be like if you called an American soldier a Republican soldier or a Democrat soldier. You could call the German soldiers of World War II Nazi soldiers in the sense that they were fighting on behalf of the Nazi regime, but individual soldiers themselves may or may not have been sympathetic to the Nazi cause. In the same way that in communist Russia, sure, you could call Russian soldiers communist by virtue of the fact that they're fighting for the communist regime, but individual soldiers may or may not have been communists. This is why let's say, for example, there were several plots to kill Hitler during World War II on behalf of certain Germans. Let's say that one of those plots had succeeded, and Hitler had been killed, and let's say a party called the Democrat Party had taken power in Germany. Well, they would still be using the same army, they would still be using the same soldiers, they would be using the German army, they would be using German soldiers. They wouldn't suddenly replace the whole army because they were Nazis. No, they wouldn't do that. So that's what I'm getting at. And that's why when you watch documentaries, serious documentaries, professional documentaries about World War II, they don't refer to German soldiers as Nazi soldiers. They don't talk about the Nazi army. They talk about German soldiers and the German army. And so when I hear people talk carelessly about Nazi soldiers and the Nazi army, it doesn't make sense. And I already know that they don't really have a nuanced view of these things. And by the way, of course, in the case of both Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, it was certainly true that soldiers certainly had to at least profess adherence to the ruling ideology. They had to. It's kind of ironic in that World War II and Nazi Germany is referenced so much in the modern day, but one context it's hardly ever referenced within is the context of thinking about Big Brother, the surveillance state, which is strange because Nazi Germany, like Communist Russia, had a very stern surveillance state, had a very Big Brother vibe, to say the least. There were certain rules in Nazi Germany whereby if you as a German, whether you were a soldier or a civilian, if you said something that could be interpreted as threatening the German virtue in some way, what was perceived at the time as German virtue, you could be shot for it. And there were similar laws in Communist Russia. So individual soldiers in Germany in World War II, they may or may not have been sympathetic to the Nazi regime, but they damn well had to profess to be anyway. Same with the Russian soldiers under communism. And so it goes even beyond the fact that people in the modern day use the word Nazi just so loosely. The moment that someone just carelessly calls someone else a Nazi, I can't take them seriously after that. I just can't, because I know that they're using it as a byword for evil, essentially. And they're doing that because they don't have a really nuanced understanding of history. See, everyone knows about World War II, everyone knows about Hitler, everyone knows about the Nazis, and so for most souls, or for many souls, that's all they know about history. So when they think, this is a bad thing, I don't like it, they think of the worst thing they know about from history. They think of the Nazis, they think of Hitler, so they just call someone a Nazi. It's a really low intelligence play, if you like. And so the funny thing is that even those who actually wander around, with skinheads and with swastikas, even they are not technically Nazis, because again, the Nazis were a political party. To be a Nazi, you have to adhere to National Socialism, specifically a National Socialism that relates to Germany. Now, I guarantee that, if you go up to those guys that march around with swastikas and with skinheads, if you ask them to lay out National Socialist policy for you, they couldn't do that. They don't care about stuff like that. What they like is the imagery of the swastika because it's edgy, because it instills fear in people. That's why they use it. They're not genuine adherents of National Socialist ideology. There are some out there that are, for sure, but the average skinhead who's wandering around with swastikas tattooed on his face, no, they're not genuine National Socialists. They just like the imagery. So, there's all kinds of, but of course you can't allow this kind of nuance in the modern day. We live in very idiotic times, and things have to be simplified and dumbed down until so everyone can relate. So there's a good guy and a bad guy, and everything is very simple. But reality isn't that way. So, concerning Nazi Germany, first of all, I've talked about those that carelessly use the word Nazi, almost always on the political left, and they use it because for them it's a very quick and easy byword for evil. So now I want to address some fallacies concerning Nazi Germany that often or typically emerge from the far right, because it's relevant to what I'm going to talk about. Believe me, this is all about aliens. So, what's absolutely true about Nazi Germany, or the leadership, certain figures within the leadership of Nazi Germany, is that they had an interest in the occult, specifically Heinrich Himmler, but that interest is vastly overstated quite often, and the reason for that is that so much fiction has made good use of it. If any of you play video games, if you played a Wolfenstein video game, you'll know that in most of them, at some point there will be supernatural elements, because it was known that Heinrich Himmler, he had an interest in the occult, and so obviously if you're creating a work of fiction that involves the Nazis, why not exploit that and make it a more interesting and fantastical story? So it's certainly true that Heinrich Himmler had an interest in the occult, he had an interest in Atlantis, he had an interest in all kinds of mythologies, and of course, when Steven Spielberg and George Lucas created the Indiana Jones franchise, they exploited that as well, and they had Indiana Jones go up against the Nazis who were looking for the Ark of the Covenant and so forth. But that element is very exaggerated. It wasn't as much of an emphasis historically as a lot of people are led to believe in the modern day. Again, thanks largely to works of fiction concerning the Nazis and their supposed occult interests. But as a consequence of that, there are those, and they are typically on the far right, who espouse all kinds of ideas concerning what the Nazis were capable of and what their eventual fate was. So let's talk about the fall of the Third Reich. The fall of the Third Reich was essentially inevitable because Hitler's economic policy was unworkable. Hitler's economic policy meant he was always living on borrowed time. This is why, for example, even though what would later become the Allies pretty much left him to his own devices, even when it got to the point where he was going to invade Poland and Great Britain had guaranteed them, and they told Hitler, if you invade Poland, we're going to declare war on you, quite simply, which is something that Hitler didn't want. He nonetheless still had to invade Poland because his economic policy depended upon continuous conquest. You see, every time the Third Reich would take a territory, what they would do, because they were in so much debt and because Germany was suffering so much, and this goes back to the consequences of World War I, what they would do when they conquered a new territory is that they would essentially plunder that territory, and they would take its wealth and its resources and send it immediately back to Germany. And without continuous conquest, they couldn't meet the needs of the German people, essentially. So continuous conquest was a necessary part of Hitler's economic policies. Now, what his goal was in the long term, well, that's a subject of debate, but that was the reality of the history as it happened. We don't know what would have happened in the long term, but Hitler had to keep conquering, essentially, because Germany was in so much debt, and this is also the reason that they targeted Jewish individuals, for example, and confiscated their wealth, because it was to pay for Germany's crippling debt. So that's why, even when Great Britain, made it clear to Hitler that, if you invade Poland, well, we've guaranteed Poland, so we're going to have to go to war with you. There are some historians who say, well, Hitler just didn't believe them, but either way, Hitler had no choice because of his economic policy. If there's no conquest, then Germany collapses quite simply. Obviously, I'm giving you a brief overview because this is about aliens, but that's the basic gist of it. But of course, those on the far right, what they do is they idealize Hitler and the Nazis. And so Hitler, in their eyes, if Hitler, in their view, went wrong somewhere, or if he failed in some way, it wasn't anything to do with Hitler, it was something working against him. He was betrayed in some way. That's how they'll always construe things. So what's absolutely true about the Germans in World War II is that they had exceptional rocketry. They excelled technologically in many, many ways, and that's one of the things that made them such a potential threat to the Allies, at least. But what those again, not always on the far right, I want to be careful here, because there are some who propagate these ideas and they're not on the far right. So I don't want to say that everyone who propagates these ideas is on the far right, but these ideas are often found on the far right. There is this idea that, for example, the Nazis, German scientists, let's just say, they were working with flying saucers, either from extraterrestrials or they actually created them themselves. And there's this mythology that they used. These flying saucers were operated with something called Vrel power. Now, I mentioned before Madame Helena Blavatsky. I have to make this very brief. Essentially, Vrel power, think of it like Qi. It's a kind of Western occult equivalent of Qi. If you look up the Vrel Society, you'll see how it ties into Madame Helena Blavatsky. But quite simply, these theories, and by the way, I could so easily use the term conspiracy theory, but I'm not going to do that because I don't like that term. It's another one of those terms that comes about through thinking that is not considered. It's not nuanced enough. Because, for example, the assassination of Julius Caesar was a conspiracy. So if you lived, 44 BC, the Ides of March, for example, and you knew that Hitler was going to be murdered. I may have got the date off by a few years, I can't quite remember at this moment. But you knew that Julius Caesar was going to be murdered by the conspirators. You can imagine going out into the streets and trying to tell people, and, they would just call you a conspiracy theorist. But the reality is that conspiracies happen. The murder of Julius Caesar was a conspiracy. It's conspiracy reality. Conspiracies happen. So I don't like this term conspiracy theory in the way that it's used now, because the way that the term conspiracy theory is used now is to refer to something that is not true and that is silly and that is stupid. I don't like that because conspiracies happen. They happen all the time throughout history. There are conspiracies ongoing right now. It's just a question of whether those conspiracy theories are factual or whether they're not. So I don't like the term conspiracy theory just being used to refer to something that is completely untrue. Regardless, there are theories that the German scientists of World War II had these flying saucers, and that these flying saucers were powered by Vrel power, which again you can think of like the Western equivalent of Qi power. It's that kind of idea, that idea of some kind of spiritual force, same kind of thing essentially. I'm giving you enough information here that you can go off and look it up yourselves and get the more detail on them. And so there are other theories that, for example, after the fall of the Reich, Hitler and those surviving Nazis escaped to a secret base in Antarctica, and there they await. There are some that say that they're waiting in Antarctica even now, and one day they're going to emerge from Antarctica with all of this excellent technology and just blow everyone away and establish the Fourth Reich. And now I find that idea quite fascinating, because what it is a far right. It's a far right version of the savior myth. You can find the same thing concerning King Arthur, for example. The idea that King Arthur lies asleep beneath a hill somewhere, and that one day when the world needs him, he's going to emerge and bring justice. You can obviously see it in in Christianity as it exists now, this idea that one day Yeshua is going to return from the sky and put everything right. There are always these saviour myths that emerge throughout history, and I find it really fascinating that the far right has its own saviour myth, albeit a very obscure one, a very, very obscure one, but it is there, this idea that the Nazis have a secret base in Antarctica, and one day they're going to emerge and establish the Fourth Reich, and there are genuinely souls in this world living in hope of that, which may sound crazy, but it's what they believe. And so it's fascinating to me how these saviour myths keep being created, and saviour myths come about when a certain group has what's the word? When a certain group is disillusioned, usually due to some form of defeat. And you can obviously see how that plays into the fall of the Third Reich for those that were supporters of National Socialist policy. They're holding on to this belief that one day things are going to be set right as they see it. So all of that, there is no factual basis for any of that. There is no factual basis for believing that the Nazis were working with flying saucers. There's no reason to believe that the Nazis were working with flying saucers. There is certainly no reason to believe that the Nazis ever had a base on Antarctica, or that, certainly not that they still do. The idea that Hitler escaped to Argentina, that's an idea that actually has some legs to it. There was someone who did a documentary about that, and he went into the documentary, just your average person hoping to explore strange ideas, and his idea was that he was going to do this documentary, and by the end of the documentary he'd have shown this idea that Hitler escaped to Argentina as just one more silly story. But by the end of it, he was convinced by it. He came to believe that actually Hitler had escaped to Argentina, because the Nazis did have a lot of connections down in South America, especially Argentina, and there are certain communities there of influential that come from influential Nazi families. Again, everything I'm saying, you can look it up. This to a lot of you, I know this is going to sound outrageous and bizarre, but that much is true. But the whole idea, again, that the Nazis or the German scientists were working with flying saucers powered by rail power, that they had a secret base in Antarctica, there's no reason to believe any of that. So the reason I wanted to say that much is to illustrate that there are lots of mythology surrounding World War II, surrounding the Nazis, and surrounding Germany of World War II. And what I'm about to say may sound similar to that, but it's not. What I'm about to say is just history. It's history that you can verify anytime you want, although it's often going to sound very outrageous. So, of course, Hitler made his terrible decision, or good decision, to attack Russia. And the Nazis were famously defeated at the Battle of Stalingrad. And by Nazis, I mean the regime, I don't mean the soldiers, or of course they were defeated. The Nazi regime was defeated because the German soldiers were defeated at Stalingrad. And so, of course, in World War II, you had the Western powers, like Great Britain and the United States, allying with Russia, with the Soviet Union under Stalin. Now, that was always an uneasy alliance in the first place, because obviously they had different and diverse interests. But during World War II, the Third Reich was the common threat, so they united to defeat it. After the fall of Germany, there was then a race to capture technology, essentially. And this is what really initiated the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, is this race for technology, especially after what had happened in Nagasaki, the bombing of Japan, the 2 atomic bombs that had been used in Japan. That really spurred on this race. And so, because it was known that the Germans were so advanced in their technology, especially the area of rocketry, there was a race between the United States and the Soviets to plunder that technology from Germany for themselves, which is exactly what happened. For example, in the case of the United States, there was something called Operation Paperclip, where German scientists were drafted over, Werner von Braun being the most obvious example. They were drafted over to help the Americans work on their projects, and Operation Paperclip, and again, feel free to look this up. This is not some kind of theory about anything. This is acknowledged fact. Operation Paperclip was instrumental in NASA, for example. If it hadn't been for Operation Paperclip, if it hadn't been for the German scientists that the United States had drafted over from Germany, it's doubtful whether America would have been successful in landing on the moon. And the reason I hesitated in saying that is because I'm sure I'll get comments denying the moon landing, which is fine. I'm just saying, okay, let me put it this way. Without those German scientists being drafted, NASA could not have achieved all of the great things that it achieved. NASA was able to achieve so many of the great things that it achieved precisely because the German scientists that they drafted through Operation Paperclip excelled in the areas of rocketry, for example. But this led to the development, naturally, of all kinds of experimental aircraft. So World War II ends in 1945, and then you have 1947. Now, what's the significance of 1947? 1947 is, of course, the year of the Roswell incident. This is where the alien phenomenon, the extraterrestrial, the UFO phenomenon really kicks off. And you have this alleged sighting of UFOs at Roswell. And although Roswell is the most famous incident, there was another one in Washington as well, which is less well known. Everyone talks about Roswell. But Roswell's the one that really entered into the public's imagination. And it doesn't really matter whether you think that those at Roswell saw something significant, or whether, like many do, you believe they just saw a weather balloon. It doesn't really matter. The important point is that it was 1947 and Roswell, that incident that entered popular consciousness, that really initiated this trend of the government and the military using the idea of aliens, using the idea of UFOs to essentially cover the kind of work they were doing on experimental aircraft. Again, it's no coincidence that this occurred in 1947, 2 years after the war, when the United States has its hands on this German technology and is developing this technology with the assistance of German scientists. It's no coincidence that those dates are as they are. And then what happens? Well, Hollywood does what it always does. It serves as a propaganda outlet for the elite, if you like. And so 1945, World War II ends. 1947, you've got Roswell and the idea of flying saucers entering popular consciousness. The UFO craze that would last, I would say, right up into the 90s. It kind of died down in the late 90s. But that's where it all began. So 1945, World War II ends. 1947, you've got Roswell. The 1950s, this is where the Hollywood engine kicks in, and it begins to propagandize the public concerning aliens. And so you have this glut of films that concern creatures from outer space. You've got these films where nothing much will happen throughout them. You know, black and white, nothing much is happening. There's someone in a lab coat for most of the film, and it's very dull. But at the end, because they didn't have a budget to do much else, you know, they'll see an alien of some kind, or a flying saucer will fly across the sky, or they'll have a brief gunfight with spacemen. But you have this glut of B-movies that deal with flying saucers, exactly the kind of flying saucer that was allegedly seen at Roswell. And so there you have Hollywood beginning to inject this idea in the minds of the public, essentially. And it really hasn't stopped. You go from the B-movies of the 1950s right up to the 90s with TV series like The X-Files, for example, that very much propagate the same idea. In 1995, no, it was 1994, you got Independence Day, again propagating very much the same idea. But it was really, interestingly enough, with The X-Files and Independence Day that the spacecraft, although they remained largely alien spacecraft as they were portrayed, although they remained largely the same, they kind of took on a more savage, stark image, because prior to that, flying saucers were typically understood to be really smooth, really, really smooth. But when you look at the spaceships in the X-Files or Independence Day, they're not smooth at all. They're quite jagged. They look like ships from the Predator franchise, which are also quite jagged, but the same basic shape, the same basic idea. And so this idea continues to be perpetuated. So I want to make clear that I am not saying that there is no biological life out there in the universe. I have no way of knowing that. What I am saying is that the stereotypical image of flying saucers, the stereotypical image of aliens that has consistently been presented to the public since the 40s, that is an image that has been deliberately designed and created, and it was deliberately designed and created to mask what the American military were doing with German technology after the fall of the Third Reich. That's what I'm saying. So again, I'm not denying that there might be biological life out there in the universe. I'm saying that when it's presented to you in that package, the same package that it's been presented in since the 40s, then you know you're dealing with an attempt to distract, because it's an old strategy being rehashed, essentially. And so it's very interesting in the way this continues to be used, actually. I guess we'll talk a bit about Indiana Jones. Don't worry, this does tie back. So, interesting fact. Whatever you might make of George Lucas, he is someone that has clear ideas about his creative works. And you may like or hate his ideas, but he has a definite idea about what he wants to do with his creative works. Now, when he says, for example, and I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, but I am a huge nerd, so I know these things. When he says, for example, that, when I wrote Star Wars initially, I had 9 films planned. Well, that's obvious nonsense. But it's definitely true that when he has an idea for something, that vision sticks in his head and he sees it through. And that's how you end up with the prequels, which most, like the Star Wars prequels, which most hate. But that was George Lucas's vision. And he went ahead with it, he executed it, and you may love it or you may hate it, but that was his vision. And he was never going to shift from that. Well, the situation is similar when it comes to Indiana Jones, much to the dismay of Steven Spielberg. You see, in the year 2000, you had the video game Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine being developed. And that was the first major Indiana Jones video game since Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis in 1992. Now, the developers of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, they originally wanted the storyline to revolve around Roswell and aliens, but George Lucas actually prevented them from doing that. He said, no, because I want the 4th Indiana Jones film to feature Roswell and to feature aliens, so you can't use that idea, you've got to do something else. See, I think to many, the idea that Indiana Jones would encounter aliens, it seems like something that modern day George Lucas thought of, someone who's past his prime, and he doesn't really have the creative edge that he arguably used to, depending on your perspective. But that's not true. I mean, it was only 2 or 3 years after Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade that you had scripts in the early 90s being written that involved Indiana Jones having an adventure with an alien. This is something that George Lucas always wanted to do. But you know what the irony is? Is that when George Lucas told the developers of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine that they couldn't use Roswell and they couldn't use aliens, those developers said to themselves, well, we'll have to think of a different idea. And so what they did was instead of doing aliens, they had Indiana Jones go up against essentially interdimensional beings. They had Indiana Jones going into another dimension, and these creatures from another dimension would enter our dimension, which is ironic because 8 years after that, when George Lucas finally did get around to making Indiana Jones 4, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he didn't go with aliens either, technically. He also went with interdimensional beings. He went with that because it was the only way he could convince Steven Spielberg to make that fourth film, because Steven Spielberg didn't want to have an Indiana Jones film that involved aliens. So it's ironic because back in 1999, or back in 2000, he told the developers of the Infernal Machine that they couldn't use aliens because he wanted to do aliens, so they used interdimensional beings instead. And 8 years later, instead of using aliens, George Lucas uses interdimensional beings, thereby copying the very souls he told, he said couldn't use the same idea. Kind of strange, but there was a rumour in the last week about Indiana Jones 5. I've been mentioning Indiana Jones a lot lately. I don't know why. I made a post on Twitter this week because in last week's live stream I said that I'd been playing through some old Indiana Jones games, and earlier this week on Twitter I posted some footage of a certain section in Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb, and in this section Indiana Jones is running along and very video gamey stuff. He's jumping up, he's whipping onto stuff, swinging across, running, jumping, whipping. And I said on Twitter is that, I've got a lot of experience of climbing on ropes and swinging on ropes and things like that. And I happen to know what the capabilities of a bullwhip are as far as swinging over things is concerned. And the greatest difficulty is this. First of all, you can do it. There are discussions about this on YouTube, and some say you can do it, some say you can't. I can tell you, you can definitely use a bullwhip. You can whip onto something and you can swing on it. You whip and you pull. You have to time it just right. It tightens on whatever it's latched onto, and then you can use it to swing. You just have to hope that whatever you've latched onto can hold your body weight, and it's actually quite difficult to judge the distance. It's quite difficult to know whether you're actually going to make it to the other side. For example, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, if your average person had a bullwhip and they were trying to get across that pit in the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they tried to do what Indiana Jones did, in all likelihood they would end up hanging off the whip over this pit rather than successfully swinging across it. But it can be done. The real life issue is, and the real reason why Indiana Jones couldn't use his bullwhip in the way that he does in the films, and definitely not in the way that he does in the video games, where he's just jumping, whipping, swinging. The reason you can't do that is because if the bullwhip is so secured, if it's latched on to whatever you whipped it onto so successfully that it doesn't fall when you swing on it, it also means that you would have to climb up to whatever you wrapped it around and spend quite a few minutes untangling it. That's the problem. If it's secure enough to hold your body weight, then it also means you're going to have to spend a few minutes untangling it, which really defeats the point. Because the point of the bullwhip, as Indiana Jones uses it, is that he can whip across these chasms and all these other obstacles. But if you have to then climb up to whatever you whip the whip onto to remove it, well, then you might as well just clamber over the chasm or the obstacle in the first place. So that's the part where it really falls down. Yes, you can use a bullwhip to swing over things, but the problem is that you then have to spend a few minutes unwrapping it from whatever you latched onto, and that's why Indiana Jones couldn't use his whip in the way that he does, which is unfortunate. Yeah, that's not a complaint, by the way. I understand that fiction is fiction. It was something that occurred to me this week. But I heard a rumour about Indiana Jones 5. Last week I mentioned that there were news reports that Indiana Jones 5 was going to start filming here in the Highlands of Scotland this year, and I was wondering about what that meant for the storyline, if anything. You see, Scotland is a very expensive country to film in, so usually, not always, but usually, if a film is being shot in Scotland, it's because the film is set in Scotland and they want that authenticity. You know, Scotland is not a place you come to film just for a few extra shots. You know, sometimes there are exceptions to this. For example, in The Dark Knight Rises, you know that bit in the opening with the plane, I believe that was shot in Scotland, but Scotland isn't actually mentioned in the film, so there are exceptions, but generally, because Scotland is such an expensive country to film in, if something is filmed here, it's usually because it's set in Scotland. So it made me wonder, you know, I wonder what that says about the storyline of Indiana Jones 5. And I thought, well, maybe it's something to do with the father of Indiana Jones, because just as Sean Connery was Scottish, the father of Indiana Jones in canon was also Scottish as well. So maybe it has something to do with the father of Indiana Jones. But this week I thought, I wonder if it could have anything to do with the Loch Ness Monster, because I really do like Indiana Jones. I like the films, and I've read all the novels, and there's a lot of very strange things in those novels. But you know what? Indiana Jones, amazingly, despite all of the young Indiana Jones adventures, despite all of the comic books, despite all of the novels, despite all of the video games, despite all of the choose your own adventure books, Indiana Jones has never had an adventure that involved the Loch Ness Monster. And given everything else that he's gone up against in his time, it wouldn't be that far out there. So I began to wonder this week, is this fifth film going to be about the Loch Ness Monster? That would be really interesting. I would like to see that film. But I don't think so. And if the latest rumours are to be believed, that seems to be not the case, because one thing we know about Indiana Jones 5 is that it's set in the 60s. That makes sense given Harrison Ford's age. He's nearly 80 now. But this week, apparently, the story for Indiana Jones 5, and this is where I bring it back to aliens and the government and NASA, the story for Indiana Jones 5 is going to involve a Nazi scientist that was drafted through Operation Paperclip at the end of World War II. See, this is the problem with Hollywood, of course, in the modern day, is that they really lack imagination. One reason that I really like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is that it's different. You know, it's really, really different. The problem is that a lot of souls didn't like it, so with The Last Crusade, they just repeated what they did in Raiders. Yet more deserts, yet more Nazis. At least the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, for all of its faults, at least it doesn't have more Nazis. At least it's communists. The novels are really imaginative. They have Indiana Jones going up against all sorts of opponents. But I'm sure many of you will agree with this. For me, you know, Nazis, they're right alongside werewolves and vampires and stuff being used to death, just overused. The problem is that Hollywood suffers from a crippling lack of imagination. And so if it's Indiana Jones, then of course he has to be going up against a Nazi again. But I'll say this about this. This is just a rumour, of course. But I'll say this about this rumoured storyline for Indiana Jones 5 is that the fact that this particular Nazi was drafted through Operation Paperclip, and the fact that he's in the United States and he's working for the United States government and it's to do with the space program, that is really interesting to me. That is a way to involve Nazis without just retreading the same ground that so much fiction has tread before. That is really, really interesting. But it's like all these strange things have fallen into line recently. All these things have come together. But this is just Indiana Jones 5, assuming that rumour is true. It's just another example of how this same idea concerning, and I don't know if the plot involves aliens. I highly doubt they're going to make that mistake again. But it's just an example of how these themes keep reoccurring and keep being pushed through Hollywood. And as I said earlier, as so many have said before, the truth is not going to be televised. If someone or if something is being pushed by the mainstream media, like really, really pushed really hard, and they don't mind talking about it, and they talk about it a lot, then you can almost guarantee that it's completely false. And the same is true of spirituality. You're never going to hear, for example, mysticism conveyed in the mainstream media or in a film, a Hollywood film. You're not going to. You'll have there are plenty of Hollywood films, and there are plenty of souls on mainstream media that talk about some form of spirituality, but it's typically a very, maybe that's too strong a word. I was going to say perverted spirituality. Perhaps that's too strong a word. Let's just say it's a very watered down. That's a good word, a good phrase. It's a very watered down spirituality. I give an example of this in the second chapter of my book. Actually, yeah, I managed it. I managed to throw in another reference to the content of this book. But in the second chapter, I give an example of this, specifically the statement "know thyself," because know thyself is something that's said a lot, and you will find that in mainstream viewing, but it's completely misunderstood. Know thyself is so often presented in popular culture as an examination of your own personhood, essentially. Oh, aren't you such an interesting person? Tell me about yourself. Tell me about all your funny little quirks. Essentially, it encourages narcissism. The way that know thyself is understood is it's understood in a way that encourages narcissism, because it makes the individual self, the personhood, out to be all important. You are the god of your own universe and so forth. That's the kind of so-called spirituality you will find propagated through mainstream media and in films and things like that, but never actual mysticism. Never, as I explain in the book, a perspective that points out that no, know thyself is not about scrutinizing your own tedious personhood and telling the world how important you as an individual are. Know thyself is about knowing your true self, yourself that lies beyond that personhood. So it's not about inflating the ego, it's about going beyond the ego. That's the kind of thing you're not going to see really put forth on mainstream channels. Anything that is pushed heavily in the mainstream, you can almost guarantee is false. And unfortunately, this has the effect of perverting the spiritual, or these false ideas that are pushed by the mainstream have the effect of perverting so many souls from their spiritual path. And I want to give an example of this, and I'm almost loath to do so, because I know that it risks initiating certain conversations that I'm just not interested in having. Okay, so I will talk about this individual, specifically David Icke. But I want to say first of all that I do not like the so-called conspiracy community. I do not like it at all. There's a very good reason that I don't consider myself a part of any community. There's a very good reason I don't network with anyone. I'm not interested in any of that. It only leads to negative things. But the conspiracy community is a community that is, and there are certain words that are perfectly legitimate, but you don't want to say them now because certain other souls use them, and they use them in a bad way. But the fact is that the conspiracy community is incredibly toxic. It's incredibly toxic because, quite frankly, like spirituality, the conspiracy community attracts a lot of souls who do have profound mental illness. They do have serious mental issues that need addressing. And the problem with that uniquely in the conspiracy community is that the conspiracy community, well, it's about conspiracies, it's about plots. And what you will see within the conspiracy community time and time again is that souls will just eat one another. They'll just eat one another left, right and centre. So one minute there's a figure, for example, that is, really being raised up in the conspiracy community. He's the second coming as far as they're concerned. But you look next week and suddenly, that person is an FBI or CIA asset. That guy's a Fed, and they're a disinfo agent. It's such an incredibly toxic community because it's just a cycle of souls just raising each other up and tearing each other down. It's a really horrible place to be, and because that kind of area so often attracts those souls that are dealing with profound mental issues, it just makes the situation worse. So it's not a nice place to be at all. And the reason I'm saying that is because I'm about to talk about David Icke, and I've put his name in the description box because I'm talking about him, but please, nobody who comes across this video think that I have anything to do with the conspiracy community. I don't have anything to do with any community at all. I don't want anything to do with any community. I'm not interested in your take on anything to do with the conspiracy community. I don't care about your ideas concerning the Anunnaki or anything else. I'm not interested. But I am interested in what souls do. I'm interested in souls, and I'm interested in certain souls specifically, including David Icke, because David Icke used to be a sports presenter, a sports broadcaster here in this country, and he had a profound spiritual experience, and he infamously went on a TV show that was hosted by a guy called Terry Wogan in the early 90s. And in this TV show, he announced in front of this audience that he was a son of God. Of course, this was, it wasn't like these days where you've got the internet and a statement like that. If you say to someone that you're a son of God now, I think in a large part because of the internet, there are souls that will understand that you could mean all kinds of things by saying that. But in the early 90s, pre-internet days, what the audience took from what David Icke was saying was that he was essentially claiming to be Jesus Christ, which is not what David Icke was saying. He was saying he was the Son of God in the exact same way that I would say I'm a son of God, in that I'm of the Spirit of God. And just as David Icke said on that talk show, we are all children of God. And the funny thing is, even though Christians would laugh right along, mainstream Christians would laugh right alongside that audience at David Icke, their own Bible tells them this. I mean, their own Bible says that Yeshua came as a son of God to enable others to become children of God. Just read the first chapter of John. It says it right there in the first passage of the Gospel of John. It says it right there. The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, he says, all those who are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. This is a biblical premise. The problem is that mainstream Christianity, because it's deified Yeshua uniquely and has made him the second person of the Trinity, they have to have these two different classifications of Son of God. Because Christians have uniquely deified Yeshua, they have to say on the one hand, okay, Yeshua was uniquely the Son of God, but the Bible also says that we are children of God, but we can't be children of God in the same sense that Yeshua was the Son of God, because he's the second person of the Trinity. He's uniquely God. And so mainstream Christianity has this weird schizophrenic thing going on concerning what it is to be a child of God. And the way that many Christians will express this is that, well, Yeshua is the Son of God by essence. He's the Son of God by nature, whereas we are adopted. So we're adopted children, whereas Yeshua is innately a child. By the way, the Bible, the New Testament, makes no such distinction, but that's what you get with Christian theology when it's trying to justify its own existence, essentially. The point is that David Icke went onto that show and he said something that the audience just mocked him for, and for years after, he was ridiculed. He every street he walked in, he was being laughed at, because again, this was pre-internet. Souls didn't have the internet to distract them from TV, so there were millions of souls in this country watching that TV show, and so David Icke suffered for that. But David Icke was right. Dave, did I just do a meme there by accident? um, David Icke was right concerning what he has said and what, as far as I know, he continues to say about us being children of God. David Icke is absolutely right when he talks about consciousness. He's absolutely right. Where I feel now, I say good luck to David Icke. He has to do what he feels he has to do, and he would say exactly the same thing about anyone else. I have no problem with David Icke. I'm not opposed to David Icke. I'm just telling you where I think his path where his path went wrong, as far as I can see. Where David Icke's path went wrong, and this is me tying David Icke into the subject of this episode, which is aliens. Where David Icke went wrong is with his reptilian theory, because that to me is a crystal clear example of someone becoming a victim of the very propaganda effort that I've been talking about throughout this stream. Because here you have this individual, David Icke. He had this profound spiritual experience, and if you listen to David Icke elaborate upon that spiritual experience, it's a classic spiritual experience. It's gnosis, it's divine insight, it's almost the quintessential spiritual experience. So that's brilliant. And he declares he's the Son of God. Yeah, he gets ridiculed for it, but those who know what he means, they know what he means. But then he starts pushing this reptilian idea, and that completely undermines everything. The moment that David Icke starts pushing this idea that the royal family are secretly reptilians, the moment that David Icke starts pushing this idea that the royal family are reptilians, that the presidents are reptilians, there's no way for him to come back from that, because from that point forth, okay, I'm going to stop looking at the chat. You're making me laugh too much. I have to close that. From that point forth, every single time he's in an interview, I'm thinking about what you're saying in the chat. I'm not even seeing it. I'm thinking about it and I'm laughing. From that point forth, every single time that David Icke gets interviewed, you can see in the interviewer's face that they're just wanting to get back to the subject of reptiles. They're just waiting until they can bring the conversation into a place where they can ask David Icke, who it's like this: who runs the world, David? Who runs the world? Who are these people? What are these people? They're constantly trying to get him to talk about the reptiles that run the world. So from my perspective, that's an example of someone unfortunately becoming a victim of this extraterrestrial propaganda effort, which is to say a propaganda effort about extraterrestrial, not a propaganda effort pushed by extraterrestrials. That's where I feel David Icke went wrong. And then, of course, he started talking about how the moon is not what we think it is, and that notion, strangely enough, it didn't pick up as much steam as the reptile idea. I think because David Icke's popularity within popular consciousness had waned by that point. But what David Icke has to say about being a son of God, what David Icke has to say about consciousness, that is way, from my perspective, that is way, way, way more important than anything that he has to say about reptiles, anything that he has to say about the moon, anything that even he has to say about the surveillance state. Now, when it comes to issues like the surveillance state, he's absolutely right. And these are legitimate concerns, but they're still nowhere near as important as dealing with each soul's individual state of being, dealing with their consciousness, because as I said earlier, our consciousness is our spirit. There is nothing more important than that. So for me, David Icke is a figure I'm very sympathetic to, but I really feel that by going the reptilian way, he really went off course a bit. Again, he would probably disagree with that. He would say that he's got to say his truth that he sees, and that's fine. I have I cannot emphasize enough. I have no problem with him at all. I'm not trying to attack him. I'm just telling you where I think things went wrong from his perspective. Because, okay, if you say that you're a son of God to someone, it's going to be strange to most souls. That's fine. But you can explain that. You can say to someone, no, well, look, this is actually, for example, a biblical idea. The Apostle Paul said, those who are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. Yeshua came to enable people to be children of God. That was the point of Yeshua's ministry. And you can explain what you mean by a son of God. You can say, I don't mean that I'm uniquely a son of God. I mean that we are all children of God. And most souls will warm to that. And you can explain to most souls what you mean when you say that you're a son of God. But the moment that you say that those that rule the world are really reptilian creatures, there's nowhere to go from that point, because you can't substantiate it. You can't clarify it any further. You've just asserted that those who rule the world are reptiles, and there's no way back from that. I'll just put it this way: it's not a path I'm ever going to tread. If David Icke wants to do that, that's fine. God bless him, sincerely. But it's not a venue I would go down, even if I did believe in reptilians, even if I did know for a fact that reptilians were ruling this world. I would just recall the words of Yeshua: be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. That's just not going to go down well in any context. So yeah, I would avoid that myself. But from my perspective, that's just an example of someone being put off course by this agenda to push the idea of extraterrestrials. Though again, for the third time, I'm not saying that there is absolutely no biological life other than human out there in the universe. I can't know that. What I'm saying is that it doesn't conform to the image that Hollywood and the mainstream media are all too happy to push, because it's ultimately a big distraction from issues that are far more important. Look at it this way: no one will ever ban you for talking about reptilians. No one's ever going to ban you for talking about the earth being flat. No one cares if you talk about those things, because they're not a threat to anyone's agenda. They're not a threat to anyone's power. You start talking about the surveillance state, you start talking about vaccines, that's when you're at risk of being banned, because there are souls in this world that have a vested interest in subjects like that not being broached. But you can talk about reptilians and flat earth all day, because you serve their agenda then, because at that point you're just discrediting anything else worthwhile that you might have to say. I do address the subject of aliens in my book very briefly. Quite simply, I point out that the life that exists throughout the universe is ethereal in nature, which is to say it's spiritual in nature. For example, in the Bible, according to the Bible, the book of Acts, Yeshua, after his resurrection, he ascended. So he ascended into the clouds. He literally ascended into the clouds. And as I say in my book, it's kind of strange to think that so many souls acknowledge that what they call ghosts and spirits, they're not impeded by the barriers of the physical world. They can walk through walls, for example. And I say in my book, isn't it strange though how ghosts and other spirits are always portrayed as existing on the planet Earth when they're not at all limited by that? But no, I point out that the universe is teeming with ethereal life. The universe is full of life, but it's ethereal in nature, it's spiritual in nature. And again, if you just look at the biblical accounts, the Bible itself testifies of that fact, because it's constantly talking about those that look down, not constantly, but it makes reference to those that look down on earth from heaven. And the ethereal realms are realms that exist out there in ethereal form. So there is such a thing as extraterrestrials, but to my knowledge, according to my direct experience, they only exist in the form of ethereal beings. They only exist in the form of spiritual beings. Now again, that's not to say that there's definitely no other biological life out there in the universe, but it's certainly not the little grey men, the flying saucers, that image that was intentionally concocted throughout the 40s and the 50s to cover the activities that the American government and military were involved in. It's not that, because that image is deliberately pushed. The only extraterrestrial life that I know of from direct experience is ethereal. It's spiritual in nature. Biological life, I don't know, but it's certainly not the Hollywood crafted little grey man, the Hollywood crafted flying saucer, because that was propaganda that was deliberately created to serve an agenda. And again, when mainstream media and when Hollywood are all too happy to push an image, you can almost guarantee that it's completely false. I guess, for the sake of completeness, I will address one obvious objection to what my point has been throughout this stream. The obvious objection would be, well, what about those who have had abduction encounters? What about those who claim to have been abducted and they claim to have seen little grey men, claim to have seen flying saucers, claim to have been aboard these craft? Well, first of all, such accounts are exceptionally rare. There's certain things that are being conflated very often, and it's very, very strange. But a UFO is not an alien. A UFO is not an alien. A UFO just means unidentified flying object. So almost everyone has seen a UFO at some point, in the sense that they've seen something in the sky that they don't know what it is. That's a very different thing from seeing an alien or seeing an alien spacecraft. And I've noticed that the distinction between those things has been deliberately blurred in light of the media talking about UFOs and aliens in the past week. I noticed so many souls on social media saying, "Oh, I definitely believe in aliens because," and then they'll relate this story about how they saw some strange light in the sky, and you just read messages like that and you think, wait, okay, so if you say you saw a strange light in the sky, you saw something in the sky that you don't know what it was, okay, I can accept that, but how do you make the leap then from I saw an object in the sky to I saw an alien spacecraft? Because those two things are not the same. So there are millions upon millions and millions of UFO sightings of aliens, sightings of alien spacecraft. They are exceptionally rare to the point where they're almost non-existent. But in addressing those, I will simply point out, as I do in my book, that the imagery that accompanies spiritual experiences is informed by the influences that a soul is subject to. What I'm saying is that so-called abduction experiences and spiritual experiences are one and the same thing. They are exactly the same thing. As I said to someone on Twitter this week, if I raised a child to worship a giant goose, if that child... I shouldn't have made it so funny. Why did I say it so funny? Why a giant goose? I don't know. But if that child had a transcendent experience, they would experience it... Why did I call it a giant goose? Let's say I raised a child to worship something called the Great Goose, and the Great Goose is a giant goose. If that child fully believed in that, and why wouldn't they if they were only exposed to my influence, if they fully believed that, then if they had a transcendent experience, they would, in all likelihood, have a vision of the Great Goose as I have explained it to them, as I have spent their life. Why am I tormenting this kid in this hypothetical scenario? In the way that I've raised him to understand it. Because spiritual experiences manifest before us in a way that is appropriate for our influences, in a way that is appropriate for our conditioning. This is why, for example, in near-death experiences, Christians will invariably see Jesus. It's why in near-death experiences, Muslims will inevitably witness something that is consistent with their own belief system, and so on throughout the religious traditions of the world, because your mind interprets transcendent experiences according to your influences and according to your conditioning. So, if as a Westerner you have been conditioned to accept the reality of flying saucers and of aliens as Hollywood and the media portray them, if you have a transcendent experience, then you are going to see those images. Those images are going to manifest before you. If it's a positive experience, then you're going to perhaps encounter these aliens bestowing you with wisdom, and you're going to come out of that experience and start telling the world that, we have these star brothers and they have a great message to share with us. If you have a negative transcendent experience, then you're going to undergo the abduction scenario where you're being tested on and so forth. But these are just spiritual experiences. They're just spiritual experiences seen through the lens of a mind that has been conditioned by a very particular idea concerning UFOs and extraterrestrials. But to restate, encounters with extraterrestrials and encounters with the spiritual, they are the same thing. They are both transcendent experiences being interpreted through the lens of the mind. And so whatever influences and conditioning that mind has been exposed to, that is going to inform the way that experience manifests before an individual. Now, I've talked for far too long. I'm going to stop it right there. Thank you for joining me here, everyone. There's a lot that's been said in chat. No questions though, so that's fine. So again, thank you for watching this week. As I said at the beginning, these live streams will be more topical in the future. This one went on way too long. I should have known that if I'm going to talk about Atlantis and aliens and World War II, I'm just going to go off on tangents. I'll try and keep it down to an hour for the future. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and may your moment be mystical.